Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RE227, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called When They Say Scorched Earth, They Know What They Mean. Written by sprucay. The training commandant led his officer cadets through the space station, clacking his beak in disgust. It was dirty and in a state of some disrepair, but there was no need to upgrade it, as it only got used as a viewing platform once a year. He ruffled his feathers reflexively and mused that any value it might have had was decimated by its location. They arrived in a room notably only for its large windows, out of which a husk of a planet could be seen. The cadets lined up dutifully and settled into whatever parade rest looked like for their respective species. The commandant stood looking out the window briefly before turning around smartly to address his cadets. "This is the planet formerly known as Qatar. I say formerly because it has been struck from the galactic charts to avoid anyone accidentally ending up on the planet. It is much too dangerous. Cadet Girard, how long would you suggest the planet has been barren for?" Girard pondered the question. His family ran a mining business, and so he had some experience in assessing the conditions of planets. The time a planet had been dead for offered some hints as to what materials might be available. "Sir, I'd suggest it's been barren for at least 5 centuries, although I can't be more specific than that. There are some inconsistencies that make it difficult to be sure." "A fair assessment, Cadet. What would you say if I told you that it's been barren only for 50 years? There was a gasp from the cadets. It didn't take a mining expert to see that the state the planet was in had only been caused 50 years ago was shocking. The commandant smiled with gratification. He started pacing in front of the window, the dead world reflecting in his piercing eyes. "We could teach you the folly of Girard back at the academy, but we feel the destruction has to be seen to be fully appreciated. Their civilization, on the cusp of joining the galactic community, once called this planet their home. Unfortunately, political turmoil meant that a cultist zealot gained power of the planet, and so the civilization changed. They had the technology to go galactic, but didn't want to, instead believing that to leave the one true planet would be heretical. That is, until their resources started to run out. Their religion's tenets did not include sustainability. The Supreme Leader could feel his power slipping, and so he looked beyond his solar system to another nearby." The Commandant hesitated, almost imperceptibly, but Cadet Sari took the bait. "Sir, sorry to interject, but I thought their beliefs was that leaving the planet would be heretical." The Commandant smiled, happy in the knowledge that this brood of cadets were doing incredibly well. "Perceptive as always, Cadet, yes. This seems to go against the central commandment of their religion. But by lucky coincidence, the Supreme Leader had a vision that told him that this planet had been put there by their god, and that it was theirs by right. Unlucky, this planet was already inhabited by another civilization who, whilst they had the technology, had yet to join the galactic community, because they were too busy fighting amongst themselves." As he turned to pace back, he noticed a tiny jolt of realization shudder through the body of the one human in the cadre, the first human to ever enter the academy. The Commandant had wondered if the Cadet Jameson would recognize the description. "This interplanetary war continued for a short while, but the Quatarians had underestimated this new species entirely, and ironically had been the very catalyst this society needed to unify. Well, a world spent warring against each other means that when that world wars against another world, the outcomes is all but inevitable. The cult of Qatar was crumbling, and the Supreme Leader took one last-ditch attempt at winning the war. In another vision, the terrible, horrifying vision, his god told him that to win this war he needed to strike hard at the hearts of his hated enemy. They had learnt that unlike most species, this new planet was home to organisms who rarely had more than 4 or 5 offspring and cared deeply for them their entire lives. Their god told them to kill children to break their spirits and end their civilization." The Commandant paused, as he always did at this point in the story. He counted many humans amongst his friends, and knew how much losing children meant to them. His species had countless children every year, with the death rate being incredibly high. Child death was in fact of life. He glanced at his cadets, seeing in their postures that they were actually interested in what he was saying, and that they had not slipped into what he liked to call parade sleep, where a good cadet could get some rare rest time. The best soldiers could keep their ears open, so that when challenged by a senior officer, they would be able to give a credible answer before waking up properly. The commandant perched on the ledge in front of the window, resting his old bones. As you can imagine, it didn't end well. By this point, the Gutarians had enough intelligence on their enemies that they knew what to target. Their planetary defenses stopped a lot, but not all of it, and tens of thousands of schools, creches, and hospitals for the young were targeted. It is estimated that 500 million children died in that one attack. But it did not break the human spirits. The commander glanced at Cadet Jameson, and could see muscles moving in the man's jaw. Instead, it forged them harder than any material known to sapient kind. Back on their planet, the Gutarians congratulated themselves on a job well done, until the cataclysm happened. Humanity, in their war-ridden way, had developed weapons so destructive that they dared not use them, lest another human use it on them. They called this mutually assured destruction. He saw Cadet Sari practically straining against her own discipline, and nodded at her, allowing her to speak. With respect, sir, that's insane, isn't it? It makes no sense to develop something without ever intending to use it, surely? The commandant clicked his tongue in mirth. Yes, Cadet. It does seem funny, but it seemed to work. But it also meant, incidentally, that they had developed ways of causing huge amounts of damage to a planet, but had never used it. Until now. They did several things after the attack on their young, and they did it extremely quickly, such was their rage. They retrofitted a huge craft they had been developing for their fight against the Gutarians. They made it so that it would run on a skeleton crew, and that it could take a huge amount of damage. It carried 2 smaller craft with it. These smaller craft were not given their own engines of any kind, so they could carry more guns. They were called triremes and were fully automated. They were decked out with as many guns as they could carry. The ship was named Shiva. The commandant stood and moved out from between the cadets and the window. He pressed a button and an overlay flickered onto the glass. He brandished a pointer. The overlay indicated where the dead planet was relative to its star and the rest of its system. Cadet Jorik, at which point would you leave hyperspace in the system? Jorik stiffened, adjusted his vocalizer, and answered, Galactic regulations state that you should only exit hyperspace at the outer edge of a star system to avoid accidental collision with planetary bodies. You can only exit hyperspace within a system if tactics dictate, and only into a large gap between orbits. He had sounded robotic, not only because of his vocalizer, but also because it was one of the many regulations they had to learn by rote. The commandant nodded. They tapped the glass and it zoomed in on the planet Garter, where the dot glowed like it was a moon. That dot was where the Shiva exited hyperspace. The gathered cadets gasped and lost their composure briefly, before remembering who was in front of them. The commandant had turned away from the cadets in anticipation of this. If he'd seen them, he'd have to been forced to discipline them, and he'd been in the game for too long to discipline cadets for something completely understandable. I obviously don't need to go into detail about how crazy that is, but they were really, really angry. And not only that, they launched a superluminal round as they exited hyperspace. Cadet Hamra. What do I mean by that? Cadet Hamra's frills shuffled as he prepared his response. Sir, a superluminal round is when a munition is launched at a ship's exit hyperspace, so that while the ship slows, the munition carries on at extremely high speeds, causing extreme damage. It is an extremely difficult maneuver, sir, as the timing is critical. Too early, and the round won't leave hyperspace. Too late, and the round will be going too slow, meaning it might hit the ship that fired it. The commandant nodded. Yes. The only time it has been done effectively is this time, and it was extremely effective. A super-dense, non-explosive round traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light impacted the planet, vaporizing a large area of the planet's crust and exposing the core, spewing kilotons of material into the atmosphere. A third of the planet's surface was annihilated in this one hit, and the rest would have been killed off within weeks as it stood. But that wasn't enough. The triremes launched and entered orbit and immediately started firing all their guns at the planet, spinning on their horizontal axis so that they could maintain fire with the other set of guns while the first set cooled. The triremes had a wide angle of fire to cover as much of the surface as they could from an equatorial orbit. They targeted the part of the planet that had not already been destroyed. As they did so, they impacted as many of the artificial satellites as they could, effectively cutting off the planet from the rest of the galaxy. This took its toll on the triremes, which is why they were not crewed. They broke apart, with the largest piece falling from orbit and the remaining debris forming a deadly cloud around the planet. But not before they had scoured the remaining surface of the planet. By falling out of orbit, they caused even more damage. As they fell, boosters fired, causing each ship to hit one of the poles of the planet. The Commandant tapped the screen again, and figures appeared. The cadets stood there, with their mouths open. At this point, a third of the planet was destroyed, down to the core level. As the planet spins, you'll notice the crater. It has been smoothed by solar winds, but it is still there. Of the remaining surface, 80% was what we would call colloquially as glassed. Additionally, the gases that had been blasted into the atmosphere had re-wintered the planet. It is estimated that at this point 90% of the Gutarians had been wiped out. The humans, with one ship, had destroyed a planet to a level not seen since. But they weren't finished. At this point, representatives from the Alliance had arrived. They had been monitoring the conflict in case they needed to intervene. A cataclysmic attack was deemed something they should intervene in. As they arrived, they saw the final act of the Shiva. The Commandant paused and tapped the screen, causing a close-up infographic of the Shiva to appear. On the graphic, a small section of the rear of the ship was highlighted and shown separating from the vast bulk of the vessel. That small section was the crew cab. It had a single-use hyperspace launcher, life support for the crew, and not a lot else. The other 99% of the ship was now a hulk. And with a little help from physics, as the crew cab detached, it started drifting down to the planet. The Alliance observers scanned the object for explosives and instead found it to be dangerous in a different way. It was a framework of composites into which had been embedded radioactive materials, now known to be the sum total of all radioactive waste produced on Earth up to that point. It is still the most radioactive man-made object ever recorded. The Alliance observers were helpless. They could not approach the object as the radiation was too great. They could only do basic scans as the radiation disrupted their instruments, and so they had no idea that there was a remnant of the civilization left on the planet. Even if they had known, the debris field caused by the triremes made it all be impossible to get down to the surface and back up before the hulk impacted. They watched as it descended. The humans had planned it meticulously so that as the hulk approached the planet, the bulk of the remaining 20% of untouched surface spanned underneath it. It had lost a good portion of its bulk to the atmosphere, but had enough left to wipe out what was left of the survivable part of the planet. In the impact, hundreds of thousands of tons of radioactive materials were spewed into the atmosphere and circulated in turbulent currents caused by the attack. Not only that, the impact had managed to get through the crust of the core of the planet, effectively poisoning it with radioactive material. The Commandant sighed. The cadets were deathly silent in awe at the destruction that had been described. He found this moment bittersweet. On the one hand, he reveled in this ability to tell the story. On the other, the story itself was horrific. The planet had been totally sterilized, rendered down to its core level of 2 places. Surface is turned to glass everywhere else. Atmosphere and magma poisoned with radioactive material. Planet put into eternal winter with dust. The changes in mass and the impact on the core would cause the planet to lose its atmosphere within a decade. Apart from a few thousand who were off-planet, the Gutarian species had been wiped out entirely. In one fell swoop, humanity had won the war in the most brutal way possible. He tapped the screen, and the graphics disappeared. The cadet stared at the planet with a shocked appreciation of what had put it in that state. Now you all know that humanity has been accepted as associate members of the Alliance, and that this wasn't that long ago. The humans responsible for planning and carrying out the attack, including the presiding leader of their world at the time, took full responsibility for the attack and were imprisoned. They also signed an agreement that they would never carry out a similar scale attack again. These were both prerequisites of them joining the Alliance. The records of the event were classified. Anyone who was interested enough to research what happened to the Craterians would find details of a natural extinction event. We've got special permissions to show our officer cadets all the lessons that we want to teach, and I must admit that it is a funny feeling giving this lesson to the first human ever to attend our academy. He glanced at Johnson, who looked as shocked as the others. Cadet Carre, what lesson have you learnt? Carre clicked her mandibles and responded, Sir, with proper planning, a small force can defeat a much larger force. The Commandant smiled. Not often the first response, but yes, that is a lesson that we would like you to take away. Proper planning is crucial to an effective action. Cadet Jameson? Jameson looked shocked that he had been asked. He was still struggling to comprehend this action from the past of his species. Sir, ensure that any action you take, you can deal with the consequences of it not going as you expect. Good, the Commandant replied. The Craterians had not even considered their plan not working. If they had, they might not have carried it out. As it is, who knows if they could have done anything about it. He stopped front and center in the cadets and turned to face them. There is a final lesson that we would like you to take from what you've learnt. Any ideas? The cadets were silent. There was one they were all thinking but didn't think it was appropriate to say. The Commandant glanced between them. It is rare that anyone gets this one. It is a simple argument. All the more pertinent considering your colleague, Cadet Jameson, and that humanity is becoming a large part of the Galactic Alliance. It stems from the sheer brutality of their attack that has developed from their millennia of infighting. We have tried to flower it up, make it more official or appropriate, but there is really only one way to say it. The final lessons. Don't fuck with humans. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank our T5 Patreon and channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.